this is the moment where, when I'd like to say that it's a pity that we have only 12 minutes, and
Me too.
I hope that we will have a chance to read soon a more or less finalized version of this investigation, because I had a preliminary version, and it's really fascinating in all the details that could not be given in this presentation. So really ask questions about the to give a chance to Régis to go more in depth to in this topic. I will try to get back to the beginning of your presentation and your paper, this idea of a continuity with late Soviet politics, or even with early Soviet politics. You're tracing into the 20s, right, to the beginning of the Soviet Union, and you are talking about the interfront strategy implemented in late, late 80s, early 90s, right, at the turning point and the beginning of the independent Russia, I would say. This is very kind of counterintuitive for some of us, considering that the common vision is that security policies and foreign policies of the Soviet Union disappeared completely with the disappearance of the country, and that structures themselves kind of disintegrated. This idea that something was kept from these years to now. I would like to ask you, what kind of continuity are we talking about? Is it a conscious continuity of a state policy? Does it mean that Russian state inherited this policy and continued implementing it, or, I mean, the decision coming from above? Is it keeping a practice of a specific elite group, which is the security services? Is it supported by the state from your point of view? Is it kind of independent practice kept by the security institutions? Is it individual initiatives or initiatives of some people inside the elites from what you, yeah.
I see. That's a good question, and it's a good opportunity already to look at the history. Indeed, the first example I got, it is not my investigation, I just picked up this in some books, the one of Sabine Dulin on the Sikh borders, which is, this is not a theme, but she speaks about that. And in 1924, there were some cases where the former, not the KGB, it was the GPU at the time, for example, they dressed as peasants and they went on the other side of the border, for example, in Belarus, and they took some territory. At the time, it was different. The idea was not to keep a Republic of the Union in the Russian sphere of influence. It was about consolidating the border and so on. Then it happened during the Second World War in Poland, when there was the sharing with Germany, and there were some parts of the border which were taken through these techniques, always the same, which always look alike, some people's uprising going on the other side of the border to take this. And then it was in the 90s, and then it is a different story, and this is, I think, the same than today. Where you, as Bakatin explained, he said the KGB was behind the creation of the Interfronti in the republics of the Union, in the ones which were showing that they were not obeying anymore to the center. This is the last head of the KGB, we say, okay, it's a source. Huh? So this is what happened in the context of the dissolution of Soviet Union. To answer your question, I asked if there was even some manual or some textbooks where it was written, this recipe, first you do that too. Apparently they are not. I think this is a know-how of kind of colonial or post-colonial secret services which are using it. It is in their, they know how to do that. This is quite specific for Russia, probably because the empire was just at the door, which is very specific. France can't do that in Africa. It's more complicated for us. So I think there is a know-how which looks like quite natural, and also probably it's a know-how which doesn't need any textbook, because probably it's also very well rooted in the at the beginning, at least in the Soviet ideology. The people are raising against the empires, the other kind of, the liberal or bourgeois regimes and so on and so on. So I think it comes more from that. And then as it has to look like people surprising, they let some individuals doing. And Gherkin and such people were exactly doing this, and at some point, the FSB had just to say, okay, guys, now you go too far, you have to be stopped. They didn't understand, it was even bloody.
A question in terms of know-how, and to what extent is this know-how very well mastered by the actors themselves? My question would be about secrecy. In this armed conflict, and also in the previous separatist conflicts, everybody knows that Russia is intervening, and nobody knows that Russia is intervening. To what extent is it explicit, implicit, hidden, visible? And is there a dynamic between the beginning of the 2014 and now in terms of visibility or not of Russian presence on the ground?
Yeah, this is the same story on the little green men in Crimea. We knew that they were not coming from the moon, they were coming from Russia, but still they were keeping the lie to say, no, they are not Russians. This is the strength, I think, of Russia, to be able to lie. In this case, obviously, to lie and to, while everyone understands where it is coming from, and to continue to keep these lies. But again, they try to go as much as they try to leave the people, the volunteers, as much as they can. So the figures, for example, I was given, I don't know, I think they are quite serious, but for example, that in 2015 there were some 30,000 fighters on the rebel separatist side. 10,000 were just Russian soldiers which were demobilized the day before, and then they were as volunteers on the front. And we saw, I never saw so much Buryats when we were close to the Debaltseve city. Then 10,000 volunteers coming from Russia, a lot of people, and we saw with Alec yesterday that these people can be sincerely volunteers. They can come for money, for ideology, because they are nationalists, belonging to some extreme right movement, communist movement, and whatever, but they are really volunteers, and a lot came for no money. And I talk also to a lot of people who say, I didn't get my salary since 6 months, and they were still here. And 10,000 probably, which were local people, and also which were, so I think this is why, how it works, and how the lie can continue, and the fiction of this can work, because it has some truth, and the point is that they have to defend the land of the Russians, or the Ruski Mir.
Mm-hmm. So what is the room for maneuver for the locals?
What do you mean?
I mean, to what extent are the locals involved in decision making and managing?
Very, very, very small. I think so. For example, and as I explained in the paper, there are thousands or hundreds of consultants from the FSB, for example, which are controlling all the part of the society. It's not only about security, of course. It's really discoordinated, and not coordinated, but decided at Moscow level, at least for the big decision, the big strategy. But it goes even to the small ones. And as I said in the paper, for example, I was told that it was even true for the society. For example, the trade unions. And one day I was informed that the trade union would be a new one for the miners of Makayevka, would be created. So I went to the General Assembly to look, because I wanted to see the curator of the FSB, what it looked like. And indeed, they created it. It was really, the boring procedures where you create a new trade union, a new organization, and so on and so on. And after 2 hours, they asked one guy to come to speak, and they say he's the chief of the political department of DNR. They didn't give even his name. So he came, he praised them, he said, you should remember that a lot of people died, so don't be too critical with our state, and so on and so on. And then he just left. And I talked with the guy who was elected as the chairman of the new trade union, and he talked to this guy, and he told me that he is Russian, but he has some ancestors who are buried here. But I could see in this case very precisely how even for this, for example, for a creator of a small trade union, after all, it was totally under the control of the FSB in this case, and it goes for all part of the society. And one of my sources, for example, is he was in charge of, partly in charge of I would say the memory. For example, he was organized, be sure that this school will be renamed after the name of a hero of the DNR war, and so on and so on. So it goes very deep in the society.
Maybe we could open the discussion. Dominique.
Okay. Régis, a lot of the examples you're giving here tend to be 2015 or late 2014. That is after, obviously, there was direct Russian military intervention, and then Minsk I, and then you've got the kind of consolidation. You mentioned the elimination of the warlords, Labatma, and so forth. But there's also 2014. I mean, in the film this afternoon that will follow, we'll see a lot of that, the complete chaos, but in a sense, the absence of a Ukrainian state, at least in terms of being able to provide for law and order. So the narrative is a great deal about Russian control, Russian use, geopolitical, and so forth. And clearly there are several phases here, and there's a post-Minsk I phase that goes on. But there's also let's say, an alternative narrative that would be, you've got the state that, I wouldn't say collapsed, but essentially is no longer able to perform simple functions, such as preventing a few people from storming a building. And the police essentially no longer are reacting to whatever orders emanates from Kiev. And in this complete chaos, then you've got people literally coming out of nowhere, or marginally, that is, people who were in marginal or non-existent positions before, politically or socially, that they get guns and so forth, and they're players. But very quickly, they become extremely dependent on whatever resources they can get from Russia because of the conflict. So it seems to me in 2014, there's a great deal of agency here on the ground. And Russia seeks then to start to co-opt that into its geopolitical agenda. But I don't see that in your narrative. Your narrative seems to be focused on the consolidation period.
Yeah. First, because when I managed to convince some of my newspapers to go in the Donbass, I went it 10 years before in 2004. We forgot a little event, by the way, at the time when there was the Orange Revolution, and it was clear that Yushchenko would win. Mr. Lushkov, at the time the mayor of Moscow, came to Donetsk one day to see and to try to agitate the idea of separatists. It didn't work, he left immediately. So it was the first time I went there, and then I came back for the election of the November. So I missed a little bit this part, and this is part of the puzzle that certainly I didn't see as well. I think it's complicated also because we should see also all the history of Donbass since long, but at least since 10 or 20 years or so, who were controlling the institutions, who were the policemen, what was their ideology, how they were looking at Russia and Ukraine. And it would be certainly very useful to do so, to understand also why most of the police forces and so on left, and they were immediately on the side of the separatist movement, or at least the anti-Euromaidan movement. That's certainly a part of the answer. Another part of the answer, and I got a lot of people who told me this also, that indeed, not only in 2014, but the years before, the state was not there. And they were complaining about the roads, which were awful, the schools, which were in a terrible state, and so on. And most of the people, they admitted that they don't blame Ukraine to oppress them. This was not the point. The propaganda was saying this, but not. But the people were admitting that it was not this. But they said, where is the state? In which kind of school are which kids are going, and so on. And so they were expecting, and this is partly the support for the separatist movement was coming from them, they were expecting that maybe with Russia it would be a bit better. and they were even expecting that Russia would annex Donbass. They didn't get that. It could be another story because Russia had to create a tool. So, but yeah, I miss indeed and this is where, for example, there were some people who really did some live journal and so on. From the other side, there is Alena Stepova, who did a very good book. Now she's in Kiev, but she really told the story from where she was living in Sverdlovsk. Or, for example, Yudi Fedorovsky, who is a supporter of LNR, is a local historian. He's extremely well informed, and he supports LNR, but that's really interesting to listen to him because he really does his work to try to describe what he saw, and he explains also this. This is what I would love to do, is to really read this and try to put it on the paper.
And I think we'll see this local part in the film in the next couple of hours. And this is we are very happy to have this double light from the perspective of Russian policy and from the perspective of local dynamics in this session. So yeah, be there for the film also. Please.
I have a question about meso level, because we are talking about average people and how they felt and behaved, and we are talking about external player, which is Russia, or weakness of Ukrainian state. But I think we should bring into the picture local elites, because if you talk to people from Donbass, they say that for Donbass, very important were these local elites and long tradition of playing the game, being in and out, and through this bargaining a lot of economic or political preferences. And so the question is, what was the role of local business or political elite in developing this conflict from your point of view and your sources?
Indeed, because again, I was coming from the Caucasus and I was looking at the things geopolitically, so I really focused also on the relations between the Russians and their guys on the field and the people they choose to lead the movement. To answer to your question will be a continuation to answer to the question that Dominic asked, because these people played also a role probably in the weakening of the Ukrainian state, not only at the time of Euromaidan or the anti-Euromaidan movement, but even before, the years before. So I didn't really investigate on that. They were extremely present, probably more in the LNR than in the DNR. By the way, the prime ministers, the ministers, mostly in Lugansk were local people. At some point, there were a lot from Stakhanov. There was a kind of group coming from here, not Plotnitsky, but I think Tikliakov and all these the other guys. And the role of some oligarchs, or very small oligarchs, by the way, as Efremov, for example, who still retain, I think, some influences. And most of the, at some point, so most of the so-called ministers of the movement were from the local elite, the local business, and so on. More in the LNR. I think their role. They mobilized very early, and for example, in Lugansk, the first demonstrations were very much organized by Efremov and his people, and more than in Donetsk. It was another story. I don't know. I can't explain why, but the two republics are very different. I mean, in one republic, it was really Akhmetov who was the king, the kingmaker. So it's another situation where you don't have any people comparable to Akhmetov in Lugansk. So it was Akhmetov was more in the geopolitical game, certainly, immediately dealing and with Moscow and with Kiev, while Efremov probably as well, but certainly at another level, because he doesn't have the same weight. So maybe they played a bigger role, but I'm sorry I can't go too much in the details. It's also because it's not that easy to work on this topic on the ground, so we spend sometimes a day, and at the end of the day we didn't get any very satisfying interview, because it doesn't come this way.
someone has to push back on the Civil War talk, and I think they'll have to do it. I think because this is an area where I think political scientists have to part ways with a lot of other observers of this conflict. The argument that Ukraine is not a civil war, that the Donbass is not a civil war, really hangs around Russia's involvement. And I completely agree with you that Russian security forces are the central nervous system of this rebellion. Without Russian involvement, they would have been defeated a long time ago. But two things can be simultaneously true. It can be both an interstate war and a civil war at the same time. And the extent of external involvement in this conflict is not just not unique, it's not uncommon. Right? I mean, if many rebels around the globe enjoy extensive external support. Democratic Republic of Congo, Libya. NATO was the rebels' air force there. In Syria, there's Pakistan support for the Afghan Taliban. Yemen. I mean, I can keep going. If we're not allowed to call this conflict a civil war in some limited sense, so we can analyze its local dynamics, then we have to discard a lot of other wars from our data sets. And at that point, there'll be not much left. And this central focus on Russian involvement, which I completely agree with everything you said, but this central focus on Russia as the dominant actor really limits our ability to explain local variation. Why, say, one village fell much more quickly to the rebels, or to the pro-Russian rebels, or however you define it, than another one did. So yeah, I just wanted to put that on the table. So I'm wondering if it's not a civil war, then how do you define a civil war?
No, you're right, and we have to ask this question, and this is why also in the paper I mentioned, for example, the two people who had their kind of live journal, and they are from opposite sides, so it is interesting to read them, to take time to see how they were describing the situation and so on. I think it's not a civil war. There is certainly, and this is why I want to join you, civil discontent, very important in the Donbass, and much more than what often we read. I mean, there was, again, with the eye of the Caucasus, where we put too much we emphasize too much the importance of the ethnicity and so on, but still it was quite obviously a problem, and it was not seen by many. But the difference between a discontent within the society and the war is a big difference. Obviously, and basically this is what you say as well, there would be no war, there would be no tanks coming from Russia. So the things could be, if there would be no tanks, there would be maybe a discussion within the, let's say, Ukrainian, or the former Ukrainian society, and there was some chance to not go to the level of the war. So this is why I think to become a war, a civil war, it has it requires the implication in this case of Russia. What Bakatin, so the last head of the KGB, says, he says that the KGB was behind the creation of the Interfront. So Interfront, it was mostly in the Baltic states, but also in Moldova, some movements which were created from people who wanted to keep the Soviet constitution and were against the independence of them. And he says that so it was created in the republics which were showing which were refusing to obey anymore to the center. He speaks about the logic of divide and rule, which has stimulated the divisions within the society in these republics, within two sides which can't reconciliate after that. Every word is important in what he says in his book, and which produce some social tensions. And he said, instead of a dialogue, a patient dialogue, and a quiet approach and a measured one to solve the conflict inside these republics, the center preferred to use the formula: if you refuse to obey, then we will create interfronts. I mean, somehow he answers to the question.
Briefly.
Listen, this is radioactive because the minute in the context of Ukrainian studies we say civil war, since it is the narrative of Russia, then it's kind of disqualified at the get-go. You can't basically take the narrative of Russia and claim to have a scholarly argument because Russia says it's a civil war. But Yuri's point is not about the use by states of concepts like public discourse or information war. It's about concept for us as students of violence or wars. I mean, how do we distinguish, how do we explain, how do we even describe what's happening in Syria? Where everybody says it's a civil war, look at, hundreds of thousands of people have died. Yeah, the Americans are bombing, the Russians are bombing, Hezbollah is doing the fighting for the Syrian army and so forth. We still call it a civil war, even though the Syrian army is actually incapable of fighting. It needs all kinds of external support, including by Russia, but we still call it a civil war. Elena's point yesterday was different. It was from the ground. From the ground, we see in a movie, people are being buried. Turns out they're locals. Right? Of the 10,000 people who died, civilians and combatants combined, most likely 90% are territorially Ukrainian. By territorial Ukrainian means they're from Ukraine, irrespective of how they think of themselves and orient themselves. And of course, there's massive Russian intervention. But the fact of the matter, when everything is said and done, Ukrainians are killing Ukrainians. That's Yuri's point.
Yeah, I got it, but when we are doing an investigation or research, let's say, coming to the word, should I put in my article the words civil war or not is not that important. What is important is to describe the dynamics on the ground, who is intervening, why, what is the part of the society which wants to split or not, and for which reason, and so on. We try to describe it. Then after, if you label it as a civil war or not, it's not that important. Sometimes it's even risky because it's not by chance that Russia, in this case, or Ukraine on the opposite, would use or not the terms of civil war, because already that word are not designed to describe the situation, but to wait on the political scenes, on the diplomacy, and so on. So that's not by lack of courage, but sometimes to not put that word also is a way just to leave the word that no one wants. I mean, if you put then no one would read your story anymore. He says that it's a civil war, okay, I don't want to read it. He says it is not, I don't want to read it. So better to avoid and to try to describe it, the logical. Again, I mean, I'm just repeating, but to reach the level of the war, you needed some arms. And I'm not saying this to be anti-Russian, that's not the point, that's just a fact. If in this case, and you are right, I mean, there is maybe not a single conflict, but there is not an external external players which are taking part of the conflict. I don't know if it is existing even. So you're absolutely right to underline this. But again, in this case, there would be no war. And as Bakatin explained, there would be still a lot of rooms for discussion and not to reach the level of the war.
Hi, thank you, Régis. I found your presentation really interesting, especially since you have a perspective from on the ground. So my question is about the dynamics on the ground. So since the conflict began in 2014, a lot of people have actually left this region, and my question was if we're following this kind of the perspective that you're putting forth, which is that a lot of this is rooted in civil discontent, and that since 2014, the separatist movement has moved away from that and has become a geopolitical tool of Russia. How has people leaving the region affected the dynamics on the ground?
Thank you. First, as soon as it was more quiet, as soon as it was more quiet on the ground and less dangerous, people came again, even from the Ukrainian side or from Russia, immediately. I don't know exactly, I was not there recently, but as the conflict is a very low intensity one, very probably they are coming back again. How it affected, I don't think it changed so much the situation. I mean, if we look at it on the geopolitical point of view, I mean, it's part, I mean, this is not, I would say, the problem of Russia in this case, who wants to get this tool. So I don't see that there is a huge impact, in fact, on the conflict itself.
Okay, we have 2
I don't know.
minutes. We have 2 minutes left. Yulia, your last question.
I wanted to make a remark. I will go directly to the question. My question would be about also local agency and local elites. And in your paper, you have a very good example of local agency. You have this Communist Party leader, Litvinov. So my question would be, would you inscribe him also in this kind of Russian interventionism, or is it he represents just only local dynamics? It's the first part of the question. And second one, why he's so frank with you? What actually happened to him? And maybe it's also revealing this local versus Russian interventions.
Maybe introduce Litvinov, who is also one of the characters of the film. So keep in mind this case in this example.
And to answer to Yulia's question, it would be a way to again answer to Yuri. I mean, apparently, if I trust him and I try to check...
Who is Litvinov?
Litvinov was, he's the chief of the local Communist Party from the Donetsk region. He's Russian by his ethnicity, let's say, and just a small regional leader. And he took part from the very beginning. He was part of this society who was really convinced that Donbass has to split. And the day of the 22nd of February, the day after, he said, okay, we have to split, and he was very involved in the movement, and he's the one of the people who really pushed to have the referendum. And why? This is why I would add something to answer. He said because we were just few thousands in this region, which is 5 million people in the region, in the old Donbass, which were supporting the idea of independence. And we needed some political legitimacy. So we had to organize a referendum. And this is why Borodai, who is a Russian citizen with an FSB background, came the day before and said, are you sure that you will win? And if I trust even Litvinov, it was not that sure finally. And Litvinov said, we will win for sure. And this is what happened. I'm not speaking about the conditions, if it was a free and fair election, referendum or not, but whatever. So they were looking for that. They needed this, and he got it somehow. Of course, a lot of people, IDPs already left the region and so on, so it changed totally the geography. But this is how Litvinov played his role in this.
So who is he in this picture? Part of the Russian strategy or local agency?
No. I think he's purely a guy who is convinced. He's a local guy. He had no contact almost in Moscow, for example. And even at some point he told me, and then I will answer to your second question. But at some point he told me that we needed staff. We needed some people who knew how to rule the army, to manage our finance, and we had no one qualified for that. So I wrote a letter to Mr. Putin, 6 pages asking for everything. And someone says 6 pages, he would never read you. So okay, 6 points, half page, just 6 points. We need finance experts, we need military experts, we need FSB experts, and so on. And he didn't know even how to hand this list of demands to Mr. Putin because he had no contact. If I trust him, we can't check all the information. And he said, as I'm a communist, I had some access, and I didn't know him, to Zyuganov. Zyuganov is the head of the Communist Party of Russia, his group is in the Duma, the parliament of Russia. So he says, because he's the head of a parliamentary group, he can have access to Mr. Putin once a month or once every 2 months. So I gave him this list, or I found someone to give him this list, because probably they never met any time, and in order for Mr. Zyuganov to give the list to Mr. Putin. And for example, this is how a very interesting character as Vladislav Antufeyev, who was in the Interfront in Lithuania in 91st, to fight against the collapse of the independence of Lithuania and so on. and then in 92, that guy, because he had to leave, was in Transnistria. And he created the KGB in Transnistria. And for 20 years, this Russian citizen ruled the KGB of another separatist region. And then he was fired, he left, and in July 2014, he was in the Donbass. And he brought a lot of staff from Transnistria, and they helped for a while. And Antufeyev came thanks to the list that Litvinov gave to Mr. Putin through Zyuganov. Why he is speaking? Because he lost, he was not the prime minister, and then the power was given to Mr. Zarchenko and other people, and he was just one of the members of the Soviet Supreme of the DNR, but with a very limited role. And this is one of the reasons, I think, what he was speaking, because he wanted to explain that he was one of the key persons to organize all this movement. He lost the control of it, and what Moscow wanted to do was not his project.
I think we'll have a chance to go back to Litvinov in the second discussion. We are unfortunately completely out of time. Thank you, Régis.
Thank you very much.